Science fiction people, what I'd like to do is take you from page 25 through the end of Story of Your Life. If you're watching these, this is the kind of thing that I would be doing in class as we kind of did a close read of it. Unfortunately, I can't think of a really good way to do this with you other than if I had worked ahead and I had planned out little bits of the story for you to read with questions and things like that, but I haven't done that. I don't have a good reason for that. I just haven't. So if you're watching this, I think this will help you understand the story very well. If you're not watching it, I guess, what can I say? You're not watching this. So that being said, this is going to be kind of not a rough video, but I'm just throwing it together. And I will try to add some pictures to what I'm talking about. But I do want to take you through the text. And so I've got my handwritten, notated copy here. And I'm going to go through kind of the stuff on the screen. This is not a replacement for you reading it, but I do want to point out some things that I think you should have been picking up. And right around page 25 is where the story kind of cracks open because Louise has just figured out some things that are important. And the reason that I wanted to use this story, you got me. I do want to be able to just show you the movie, okay? But the story is brilliant. And without a close read, I think that might get lost on some people because it does get a little bit into the weeds of language and physics and whatever. And you could lose the string of it. And also the movie's just so good that I understand if some of you are like, wow, this movie's so much better. They complement each other. I don't think I would agree that it's better, but it is darn good. So that being said, page 25, where she's talking about practicing heptapod B. This part right here where she says, more interesting is that heptapod B is changing the way I thought. Heptapod A, we don't need to know a whole lot more about that. It's just the sounds they make like a wet dog. But heptapod B is this really fascinating thing. In my previous video, I showed you the semigrams, the circular writing that they do. And Dr. Louise is going to learn how to do that a little bit. In the movie version, of course, I'm assuming that you've watched it by now, she, touches the screen and she gets them both and she can write with two hands. And I'll talk more about heptapod B. But what she's describing is that in this part here, she's talking about how during the summer when she took an immersive course in Russian, when she was immersed in Russian, she started dreaming in Russian. And she talks about people who do American Sign Language talk about how they have explained that they dream in ASL. And I've also been made to understand that sometimes the blind will dream in sound. Because maybe they have brightness or colors, but probably not much depending on the level of, optical stuff that they have remaining. So when she's talking about dreaming in heptapod B, this is like, I don't know what your brain works for you, but during the day, you probably go through a range of emotions and you don't consciously think, I am feeling anxiety right now. I am feeling fear. I am feeling elation or whatever. You just feel it. When Louise thinks of something, it's like a roadmap or like a sign shows up like in her brain screen, if you want to call it that. And it's one of these semigrams. And it's like Louise anxiety, aliens leave, daughter, question mark, whatever she's thinking, because she's having these like thoughts. Because as she's understanding heptapod B, she's also starting to understand, like, have flash forwards of parts in her life and flashbacks. And if you've seen the movie, in the first third of it, she has that part where she comes down from the looking glass and she's like, oh, and she sees this like bright part and this girl or whatever. And we understand that later that she is seeing her daughter, Hannah, in the movie. But in this case, we don't really get too many of those flash forwards until maybe the next section here where this starts to happen and you start putting them together. Very soon, we'll see that. So this heptapod B is kind of her way of thinking, and she's realizing, like, this is really changing the way that I think about things. All right. Let's see what else is going here. We've got this, actually the next part here where Gary is mentioning the non-zero sum game. This ties into one of the other, actually the part right before this, I believe. I'm going back to it here, where the daughter is like, you never help me with anything. What does it mean when both sides win, but there's not really a winner or a loser? And she's like, I don't know, you'll have to call your father. And then there's the heptapod B enhancing her thoughts. And then they come back to this, like when he says, you mean it's a non-zero sum game, as this politician is blathering on. She flashes forward to the point where she remembers this conversation and she tells her daughter, oh, non-zero sum game. And she's like, oh, okay, thanks, Mom. And they do that very cleverly in the movie where he says it, and then they bring you back to the flash forward where she's talking to her daughter as a teenager, and she's like, non-zero sum game. And so the movie's very clever in how they do that. They also change the color and the lighting and stuff so that you're kind of the vivid parts are where you're in a flash forward, and the more gray parts are where you're kind of in the present, I guess. I mean, the movie does and the story does kind of take place at all times, but we'll get to that. So after that, we have, let's see. As I said, it's going to be a little rough. They come back to the Fermat's principle stuff. I'm just looking for my notes. Right around page 28, some of these things come up. And one of the things that I talked about yesterday is this part here that in their semigram writing, the heptapods need to know what the point of their sentence is before they start writing it. And then they can just write it in like one pen stroke, if you want to call it, or ink blot or whatever. They just kind of like think it, and it kind of comes through their hands and it's formed. Like in the movie version, it just kind of comes from the brain right to the hands. Think of it this way. If you've ever felt that you can't communicate adequately with somebody, like words in spoken language or written language doesn't work for you to try to properly communicate the feeling. This is why we really value our poets and our writers and our musicians and painters and whatever. Maybe there's just a song that has the exact feeling of longing for something, or maybe there's a poet who coined exactly how it feels to tell somebody you love them, which is why we buy greeting cards and cards that people have made for us on Valentine's Day, instead of trying to think of the clunky ways that we could say it. Not that you shouldn't try, but you know what I mean? Like somebody has already said exactly what you're feeling very well. The point I'm trying to make is if you could just take your thought bubble and like give it to somebody, excuse me, you would be able to say like, here, this is what I'm thinking. This is how I feel about you, or whatever, like anger, love, whatever. This is what Heptapod B basically is. It's a way for you to go like and send it over to somebody or to a heptapod or whatever, and then to like get it and see it and absorb it and be like, yes, I understand exactly what you're saying. But this is the same as like their physical property of light, where light needs to know exactly where it's going to go before it even starts the journey of ending right here. Okay, so this physical principle and this language principle come together in a way to help you understand what the writer's getting at, like what this heptapod B is. There's like 9 different ways that he describes the way that heptapod B is working, and it may seem a little tedious that you're like, here's an example, here's an example, here's an example, but he's really trying to hammer this home, and we're not done there. We've got more coming. And so she's talking about this like action and whatever, and then she gets into this paragraph here, which I think is one of the most important of the story. Like, was it actually possible to know the future, not to just guess at it? Blah, blah, blah. Most people would say no, because we have free will. I like to imagine the objection as a Borgian fabulation. Consider a person standing before the Book of Ages, the chronicle that records every event, past and future. Even though the text has been photo-reduced from the full-sized edition, the volume is enormous. With magnifier in hand, she flips through the tissue-thin leaves until she locates the story of her life. They use the title of the story right there. Boom, that's what movies do. She finds a passage that describes her flipping through the Book of Ages, and she skips to the next column, where it details where she'll be doing later in the day, acting on information she's read in the book. She'll bet $100 on the racehorse, Devil May Care, and win 20 times as much. The thought of doing this has crossed her mind, but being a contrary sort, she now resolves to refrain from betting on the horses. There's the rub. The Book of Ages cannot be wrong. The scenario is based on the premise that if a person is given knowledge of the actual future, not of some possible future, if this were a Greek myth, circumstances would conspire to make her enact her fate despite her best qualities. Okay, so basically what I can say is, first of all, if you know anything about Greek mythology, like if you know the story of Achilles, you have an Achilles tendon, you know, if you've heard maybe what an Achilles heel is, your Achilles heel is like your weakness, okay? It could be a habit, it could be a substance, it could be a person, who knows, there's lots of ways. But the idea of this is Achilles was grabbed by the Achilles tendon and by the heel, and he's dipped, excuse me, I swear it's not COVID. He's dipped into the river Styx, and he's pulled back out. And of course, the part where he was held by this Achilles tendon and heel is the place where like the water of the river Styx does not make him impenetrable to whatever, invulnerable. Just like, you hydro dip some shoes, and like if you're holding onto it in a certain part or whatever, you're hydro dipping, that's the place where the paint doesn't gather. So Achilles dies by getting an arrow to the place where he's vulnerable and falls on the field of battle and ends up getting injured like that. I can't remember if he actually dies. He's mostly immortal. Anyways, injured for life. Anyways, so this, no matter what Achilles does, he's told that he's going to be injured by this certain person at this certain time, and he's like, yeah, I'll make sure that doesn't happen. But in Greek myths, no matter what you do, you can't escape your fate. Go through all of Greek mythology, and that's basically the story of like, you got to just do what the gods say is going to happen because they're going to make it happen one way or another. The other way to think about this is this idea of the Book of Ages, and I'll be putting a picture up right here. The Book of Ages is this idea of like, if you were paging through it, you would be paging through it to the point where this guy named Mr. Pocket is telling you about the point when he's talking about the Book of Ages. I know. But for me, if I was reading it, it would be me reading it. And then it would be like the movie. Have you ever seen a movie within a movie, or like the infinite mirrors where like the person looks up and they see themselves looking at themselves and whatever? This would be what it would be like when we got to the point in the Book of Ages where this is happening. You would see what's going to happen. And if you flip forward, even if you know what's going to happen next, that would be written as well. Like there's no way to get around it. Okay. So it's kind of a impossibility, but this is what Louise is trying to explain. She's explaining that she has kind of come unstuck in time, and she can understand everything that's going to happen in her life and everything that has happened. And later in the story, towards the end, she explains that during this kind of 50-year period in her life, when she's kind of studying Heptapod B, and when the aliens are here, not that they're here for 50 years, but it's kind of like, think of it like Heptapod B Wi-Fi or whatever. Like while they're here, she kind of has the power, and after they leave, it fades and then goes away. So she has like this 50-year period of time in her life where she can kind of come and go. Think about your life like the scrub line in a YouTube video. If your life is a movie, the beginning of it is when you're born, the end of it is when you die, and you can move the line to wherever you want, and you can exist and understand this part. We exist in 3 dimensions, but what Louise is doing is existing in 4 dimensions where she can come and go, but she can't change it. To exist in 5 dimensions would be to be able to go into the future, change things, go into the past and change things. There are 10 dimensions of perception. Don't ask me to explain beyond 5 because I don't think I can adequately do it, but there are videos out there should you be interested in such a thing. So anyways, she's basically explaining that even knowing the Book of Ages and whatever, I'm just a player on the stage. I know my part. I know that Gary is going to say these things and I'm going to say my lines back. It's like when I hear about people who have been in like Broadway plays twice a day for 2 years. So like 600 shows times, 600 days times 2 shows. So 1,200 times you have to play Hamlet, Macbeth, some bit part in a musical, and you have to say your lines all the time. That's what her life is like. She can visit any point in her life during this time when she has the Heptapod B, but she can't do anything about it. So every conversation, she's in her mind, it seems like she has a little bit of freedom. Like she understands, I know what you're going to say and I know my part to play here, but I can't say anything about it. And it's just kind of a private joke to me, right? It's like if you have a parent or somebody who has like maybe a dad or somebody who has like kind of a stale line or something, like they hit the lights and like, let's shed some light on the subject. And you're like, oh, Dad, that's the worst. But you're internally laughing, but you're like, ha ha, Dad, okay. That's what Louise is like. Everything just is kind of amusing to her, but she kind of has to go with it because she's powerless to change it. Because unlike the heptapods, she has a human brain with Heptapod B. The heptapods may be able to manipulate time and space and whatever, but we don't know because they also leave. So that is all stuff that we kind of learn on page 28, which is kind of important. And then we've got the part where Gary says, hey, I'm going to cook you dinner and let's go to this shop. She goes to the shop and she's like, my gaze wandered over the shelves, peppermills, garlic presses, salad tongs, and stopped on a wooden bowl. When you're 3, you'll pull a dish towel off the kitchen counter and bring it down on your head, yada, yada, yada. I reached out and took the bowl from the shelf. It didn't feel like something I was forced to do. Instead, it just seemed as urgent as my rushing to catch the bowl. So in other words, this is just kind of if you didn't already understand it, everything she does is like preordained. I have to buy this wooden bowl so it can drop on my daughter's head and bust it open and give her a stitch. In the future, a daughter I don't know one day this bowl will hit her in the head. Also, by the way, the guy that I'm going to dinner with is going to be your dad. He doesn't know this either. Movie version, he disagrees with the idea that she knew they were going to have a kid that would die of leukemia and didn't say anything. Story version, they don't quite do that. What the reason I'm taking so much time to explain this is because the value of understanding this in the story is not something you get from the movie. And I know the movie's wonderful, but you don't get that depth of understanding of this concept, this theoretical concept of the fourth dimension and what it would be like to exist in it. And maybe you're like, well, I didn't really need to know that. Maybe you didn't. But I think it's important to take the time to study some of these theories because it is science fiction class, not just a Muse class. So, Book of Ages. What else here? I'm a page behind on my writing. We're up to page 31. What happened on page Salad Bowl? What happens in the next page? There's this part on page 31 that after all the years of reading this here, I hadn't really thought about this much, but it stuck with me right after the recurring dream. It's the, while you're 3 and we're climbing up a steep spiral flight of stairs, I'll hold your hand really tightly. And it hadn't occurred to me, but that Louise knows that her daughter is going to die at this point. Like she knows now, in the now, when she's in the spaceship, or not the spaceship, when she's meeting the aliens, she's learned that she's going to have a daughter and this daughter is going to die because she kind of knows all points in her life at all times now, right? So whenever she's spending time with her daughter, like when she's doing things that are scary, like climbing things when she's too young, she holds on real tight because she's like, I know you're going to die one day. And it's going to be, maybe I forced you to do these things, but I can't help myself by like being overprotected. You're like, I'm going to do it, Mom. Gosh. And maybe that's what drove her to do these crazy things and ultimately die, but it's not anything she could stop herself from doing. I don't know. Maybe that was just something that I had picked up as I was reading that. At the bottom of this page, she makes a big old heptapod B spiral thing as I'm reading through the rest of this here. There's this part where he's like, where is it? You see right through me, Gary says, and she looks into his eyes and says, you better believe it. Because, yeah, she's had all these conversations with him. She knows what's going to happen. She knows they're going to have a baby and stuff like that. Moving on to page 33, we find out that these aliens are not a whole lot, they're not very curious bunch. I didn't really highlight a whole lot in the last 5 pages here because it takes a little bit. Like, it's also pretty straightforward. The aliens talk about stuff, and Colonel Weber's like, what can we give them? And she's like, I don't know. And he's like, can we give them something important? She's like, I don't think it's going to matter. They probably know what they're going to give us, because she's also humored by this whole thing. This is the part where she's kind of smiling like, I don't know. What do you think, Colonel Weber? Like internally, she's like, just say your line. I know what you're going to say. I know how this works out. And he does. And she's like, okay, good. That part is done. Moving on to page 34, 35. I'm going to skip ahead here, kind of towards the end. 36. Where am I? We're on page 37. Maybe I'll cut some of this out here. And then basically the heptapods leave, and she's sitting next to a guy. And I think it's interesting that she describes these two people as being, what page are we on? Sorry, let me back it up a little bit. Oh, we're on 37. I'm on 37. There's this part where she's talking to Bergert, this person we haven't met yet, who is also like another linguist, who she describes them as being spies who just kind of like pretend like they don't know each other, and they're both in on the joke or the secret. She knows he understands heptapod B and knows what's going to happen, but they're like players who are just like, you want to take care of this? And she's like, yeah, I'll do it. They both know that there's no point fighting it and like winking and saying like, we don't have to have this conversation. Excuse me. We already know what we're both going to say. Instead, they say their lines like good little actors and actresses who've done this play 1,000 times already. And she's like, this is the part where I frown, like something is happening. The heptapods are leaving. And Bergert says, yeah, they're gone or whatever. And this kind of takes us to page 39 at the end, which I think wraps up the story really well. The heptapods leave, by the way. I want to get to working with the heptapods changed my life. I met your father and learned heptapod B, both of which made it possible for me to know you now here on the patio in the moonlight. And what she's basically saying is like, most of us have had some sort of loss in our life. And the things we remember about those people are not exactly tarnished by memory, but memory changes, right? We remember things more fondly. And I don't think you should think ill of the dead at any point or people who have gone away or whatever. But um, think of it this way, it's like she's able to preserve these memories and go exist within them, and she can also choose which ones. Like, she seems to choose ones where she and her daughter don't get along, but she also chooses ones where she feels like a good mother and feels a connection with her daughter, and she revisits the identifying her daughter at the morgue. And like, she has learned to value that all of the time spent with her daughter is important, and this is the real gift that she cherishes, that she can preserve these memories and exist in them. She can go back to the good times with Ian or Gary, whichever character name you want to use, but also, she can visit the bad times in her life. And I like that she says this: am I working toward an extreme of joy or of pain? Talking about how light takes the extreme, either the extremely quick route or the extremely roundabout way, or whatever, minimum or maximum, which is something, it could be a throwaway line, but it echoes back to that thing she had said earlier. These questions are in my mind when your father asks me, do you want to make a baby? And I smile and answer yes, and unwrap his hands from mine, from around me, and we hold hands as we walk inside to make love, to make you, which, again, not as creepy as it sounds in paper, but I love how it echoes the beginning. Your father is about to ask me the question. This is the most important moment in our lives, and I want to pay attention, note every detail. And this is where this story is so clever, because the story is told in Heptapod B, and you didn't realize it from the beginning, because why would you know what Heptapod B is? Just like if you watch Arrival and you rewatch it, everything that's happening, the movie is basically like a story told in Heptapod B. I mean, it's more apparent when she has the first flashback, and then you realize that anything could have happened at any time. And they do tell it more sequentially than try to mix you up, because that's better for storytelling. But this writer doesn't exactly do that. You get the flash forward and flash back, and it works well. But then you also realize that you could read this story from the middle and go to the end of it and then come back around, and it would make sense, because the story itself is a semigram. It's written in words. It's not a image for you. But now that you've read the story and you understand it, isn't it?